Knowing more about chaos and COINTELPRO, I felt that men like Reeve Whitson were potentially much more common than I'd anticipated, always in peripheral, undefined roles. Part of the reason that Whitson seemed like such a wild card to me was that he appeared to have walked on the scene from nowhere, an outer worldly man suddenly hobnobbing with the LAPD's top brass. I wanted others who fit that profile. To cover up an operation like Chaos, the agency needed friends in law enforcement, insiders who could make arrests, or just as important, not make arrests. The most promising but frustrating of my inquiries concerned an LAPD officer named William W. Herman. I could never connect him to Whitson or Manson, but he certainly fit the profile of someone who'd helped with counterintelligence actions. When I was deep in the weeds of my chaos research, split between feeling that I was onto something or that I was risking my credibility, Herman's was a name that came up several times, usually from sources I didn't quite trust or in arcane articles from the alternative press. What I heard about him was just plausible enough to get me to look closer. I'm glad I did. Herman's story hints at how intelligence agencies have collaborated with police in LA. A longtime lieutenant with the LAPD, Herman had an unusual background for law enforcement. He had a doctorate in psychology. He specialized in quelling insurgencies. He developed one of the first computer systems to track criminals and predict violent outbreaks in cities. Daryl Gates, the head of the LAPD from 1978 to 92, hailed him as a genius, quote, praising his technical aptitude in particular. Fascinating. But Herman's work wasn't limited to LA or even to the United States. My FOIA request to the FBI yielded a collection of redacted documents detailing his extensive employment history. Concurrent with his time in the LAPD, he'd worked under contract for a dizzying list of American intelligence and military agencies: the Air Force, the Secret Service, the Treasury Department, the President's Office of Science and Technology, Institute for Defense Analysis, the Defense Industrial Security Clearance Office, and the Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency. Most of his work for these groups remains classified. You'd think these projects wouldn't have left much free time, but Herman piled on even more work, taking leaves of absence from the LAPD to pursue side gigs with defense firms. These had opaque generic names like Electro-Dash Optical Systems, System Development Corp., and Control Data Corp. This last, a weapons manufacturer in Minneapolis, relied on Herman's services for 10 years, from 1961 to 71, or so Herman told the FBI. When the Bureau went to Control Data Corp for a background check, the company claimed that Herman never worked for them. You might have guessed. Given Herman's long list of government employers, I wondered if his work for these defense contractors could have been a front for the CIA, one of the few agencies that didn't appear on his resume. As usual, official channels were useless. My FOIA request to the CIA for Herman's records yielded the same neither confirm or deny response that Reeve Whitson's had. I did find, however, a record of Herman's overseas work, much of which he conducted while still employed with the LAPD, having spent 4 months in 1967 training Thai police in counterinsurgency tactics. Herman returned to Asia in September 1968 to join the U.S. effort in South Vietnam. Documents from the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, listed him as a scientific advisor to the Army. His responsibility was to train South Vietnamese police in paramilitary techniques to deploy against Viet Cong insurgents. None of the records described those techniques in any detail, but the mere mention of them was enough to make me put a few things together. The date of Herman's stint in Vietnam, his job description, his professional affiliations, and his training made it abundantly likely that he was working for a CIA project called Phoenix, one of the most controversial elements in the agency's history. Richard Nixon had secretly authorized Phoenix in 1968. It was discontinued in early 1971. The agency described it as a set of programs that sought to attack and destroy the political infrastructure of the Viet Cong. Inside Vietnam, Phoenix operatives waged a campaign of terror against Viet Cong guerrillas with tactics including the assassination and torture of non-combatant civilians. According to a 1971 congressional investigation, the program violated the codes of the Geneva Conventions and rivaled the Viet Cong's own terrorism in its mercilessness. During the Senate hearings, a number of Phoenix operatives admitted to massacring civilians and making it appear that the atrocities were the work of the Viet Cong. Their hope was to win the hearts and minds of neutral Vietnamese citizens, compelling them to turn away from the insurgency and revulsion. A Special Forces soldier, Anthony Herbert, the single most decorated combat veteran of Vietnam, published a best-selling book, Soldier, that detailed typical orders from his Phoenix superiors. Quote, "They wanted me to take charge of execution teams that wiped out entire families and tried to make it appear as though the Viet Cong had done it themselves. The rationale was that VC would see that other Viet Cong had killed their own and make allegiance with us, the good guys." I was gonna just try to say VC for Viet Cong since that's coming up like nonstop, but that's not gonna work. Okay, so back to it. Their attempts were sometimes even more unhinged. In 1968, CIA scientists at the Bien Hoa prison outside Saigon surgically opened the skulls of 3 prisoners, implanted electrodes on their brains, gave them daggers, and left them alone in a room. They wanted to shock the prisoners into killing one another. When the effort failed, the prisoners were shot and their bodies burned. Holy, my God, that's awful. According to Seymour Hersh's 1972 book, Cover Up, Phoenix had committees set up across all 44 provinces in South Vietnam. They kept blacklists of Viet Cong fighters and had strict orders to meet weekly or monthly quotas of neutralizations. The whole operation relied on computerized indexes. The identity of the CIA leader never came to light, but whoever he was there ostensibly as part of the Agency for International Development, later revealed as a CIA front. Herman, of course, was known for his aptitude with computers, and his time in Vietnam coincided almost exactly with Phoenix's operations.